So today I'm going to talk about my latest book project. And for those of you who might be somewhat familiar with my work, you know that I've done some stuff on development management, I've done a lot on NGOs, but in the last 12 years or so I focused a lot on diasporas. And why? Well, it may seem like a deviation from my work, but it isn't when you consider that my real training, I have a PhD in public administration, but my real formation was about international development management and international development administration. And like all of you, I chose an applied field because I want to make a difference in the world. I didn't want to do research just for the sake of doing research. So I was very concerned with what are the underutilized resources that could be better brought to bear to international development? What are we missing that could help? And that's why I started my research on NGOs at a time when most people thought of NGOs in the policy community as being really insignificant, amateur, not worth really talking about. Of course, we don't say that about the NGO sector anymore. I think we're on the same trajectory with diasporas. So diasporas, as far as I'm concerned, are a really important, perhaps underutilized resource for international development. Going back to my roots in international development, though, I was a little frustrated about diasporas and development because most of what I had been studying for the last 12 years was about, a little bit over here and a little bit over there, lots of really great initiatives, but small scale and disconnected. So what really gets us to progress in international development? And I really landed on this idea of it's all about institutional reform. It isn't just about a little business or a little philanthropy. It's about getting people to change the way they think and the way they behave. So it's a much more profound phenomenon. How might diasporas contribute to that? So in my book, I look at 3 different countries, 3 different types of institutional reform. I look at social institutional reform in Egypt, I look at economic institutional reform in Ethiopia, and I look at political institutional reform in Chad. So today I'm going to talk to you about a couple of the cases from the book, just to illustrate some of my main findings. So just to give you some pictures here, these are markets in Ethiopia. These are also markets in Ethiopia. So that just gives you a bit of a visual on what I'm trying to get at here in terms of what diasporas can contribute. I'm going to be speaking a lot to this particular case here, the Ethiopia Commodities Exchange. So before we go, so in my outline here, what I'm going to talk about is I'm first going to present the challenges of institutional reform, potential diaspora advantages in institutional reform, and then I'm going to present my findings about the in-between advantage. And to do so, I'm going to give you 2 illustrations from the research. And then finally, I'll wrap up with lessons for development management. But before we go any further, I think it's really important that we're all on the same page in terms of what in the world is diaspora, okay? It's not just any immigrant. No, diasporans are immigrants and their descendants who maintain a connection, psychological or material, to their country of origin. Okay, so it has to be something that they're engaged around that's part of their identity. Okay, so the challenge of institutional reform. Well, effective change can't occur without significant local ownership or buy-in. This is a lesson that we've known for a long time in international development, but it keeps smacking us in the face again, again, and again. Why? Because it's so hard to do. Why is it so hard to do? Being embedded in existing institutions, it's really difficult for local individuals and groups to envision, let alone promote, an institutional reform. They're in a system. It's working. Who are they to try to change it? Can they even see what a change might look like? This is the challenge. Because it's so challenging, I argue that entrepreneurial behavior may be required in order to envision the change, but also to have the confidence to act and maybe even enjoy the challenge, enjoy the risk. That's the entrepreneurial spirit, right? Furthermore, I argue that diasporas may have a significant comparative advantage as institutional entrepreneurs. Why? Because they occupy the in-between space of being from the inside and being from the outside. How many of you speak French? All right, what does entrepreneur mean?
Like beginning something, starting something?
No, anybody else want to give it a try? Entrepreneur. Very few people go back to the roots. Does somebody else want to give it a try? It's taking from between. Entre means between, prendre means to take. So, how come we never go back to the roots of entrepreneur? It's about being in between, okay? That's what I got so excited about this, because of course diasporas fit so neatly into this model, right? So what I did though is I got really frustrated, as you can already tell by my introduction of entrepreneur, that we tend to use the term entrepreneur so lightly. We tend to equate everything that's a little bit innovative with entrepreneurism. But that is not the origin of the word or the concept. So I went back to the classical literature on entrepreneurism and the entrepreneurial personality. And I said, what are we really talking about here? Because if it's just innovation, that's too general, that's too broad. That doesn't give us that really, really unique thing that can set us off on a new path, right? In terms of the way people think and behave, not just in terms of a new widget, right? So I went back to the classic literature and I looked at the personality, the entrepreneurial personality and what it has. And I looked at different kinds of behavior associated with entrepreneurism. And then I brought it together with diasporas. So what I argue in this book is that entrepreneurial characteristics may be overrepresented in diaspora communities. I argue that that's the case only, perhaps only, when migration is elective. In other words, when people choose to move, they're not forced out because of conflict, they're not refugees. You might find entrepreneurism in those communities too, but I'm primarily looking at elective migrants, okay? I argue that there may be more of these characteristics in these populations. Why? Because of inherent things that I'm going to talk about in a second, the migration experience, and the diaspora identity. In terms of inherent characteristics, think for a minute, if you were considering going abroad, wouldn't you maybe have already some of the characteristics associated with entrepreneurism? You might have a high tolerance for ambiguity. You might have a high tolerance for risk. You might really enjoy challenges. You might be just curious about the world. So if that's the case, then it makes sense that perhaps there are more people with those characteristics who choose to migrate. Furthermore, another thing that we often find around the world, and this is especially noted in the Somali community, for example, is that sometimes families will designate a family member to migrate on behalf of the whole family so that they can find better opportunities and send remittances home. Now, if you were going to select someone from your family to do that, wouldn't you want to choose the person who you thought was most capable of succeeding? And wouldn't that person have these characteristics? I argue yes. But the migration experience itself may also help to cultivate entrepreneurial behavior and characteristics. Why? Because when you live in a different context, when you migrate, you're not really from here. You're not really from there. You have the opportunity to operate by exception. You don't have to worry so much about the social norms, about people judging you for what you're doing and saying, oh, no, 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 you can't do that. But because you're different, people allow you a little bit more space to experiment, to do things that are different, okay? Furthermore, in the migration experience, it's really tough. And I see there's a lot of international students maybe in this room. You guys know how it is. At first, it's all confusing, right? Everything is a big blur. But slowly you get your bearings. And with each little success, your confidence grows. And you begin to test the boundaries just a little bit more. Start with your toe in the water. Before you know it, you're down to your thigh. It's exciting. Small successes contribute to confidence, contribute to new initiatives. So the migration experience can help encourage these characteristics. finally, I argue that the diaspora experience itself may also lend itself to entrepreneurial behaviors and advantages. In this case, what I'm really thinking about is this, that when you are from a diaspora, that means, by definition, that you have an identity that embraces both here and there. If that's the case, then you have a great opportunity to hedge those identities. So you can operate by exception here, but you can also operate by exception over there, right? So when it's convenient, you're as American as they come. But when it's not convenient, you're totally Ethiopian. Okay? You can hedge those identities. You can also hedge resources. You have contacts, you have networks, you have knowledge and other information that comes from all these different places that you can bring together. So these are some of the advantages. Okay, so also there are, of course, operational advantages. And I don't want to take too much time with this because I tend to go on and on. I'm so excited about this research, and I want to make sure we have some time for questions. So, of course, one very significant operational advantage is the fact that you do have networks in these different places. And so you can be the entrepreneur. You can bridge between these disparate sources of resources, of ideas, of information, and even of the soft resources like authority and reputation, okay? Expertise, right? Also, there's this notion of change space, and this builds on the work of Matt Andrews, who's at Harvard, the Kennedy School. And he argues that change space occurs at the intersection of acceptance, ability, and authority. And I argue that diasporans may have some advantages in this regard as well. In terms of acceptance, to promote the acceptance of a change, they may be particularly adept at managing meaning. They can help people to understand, they can explain things from the perspective of the local culture and or from the perspective of the external culture. They build that bridge to try to promote acceptance, maybe even for modifications of the new idea because of the way the local context works, right? They also may have an advantage in terms of ability. They may be bringing specific expertise that is not resident in the country of origin in that particular change arena. They may also bring that other kind of networked knowledge and skills from different sources. They don't have an advantage with authority. As a diasporan, you don't have any authority in the country of origin, right? But they may have relationships with people who do, both in country and outside of country. And if they come back to their country of origin with particular expertise, they have some authority as experts. So they have some advantages there too. So what did I discover? What is the in-between advantage of diaspora entrepreneurs for institutional reform? I'm going to speak to these four components of the in-between advantage. And the first two represent phrases that were coined in my interviews with people. Actually, both of them come from Ethiopia. I'm going to illustrate what these are by telling you a couple of stories. Okay? So, the first one. This is Eleni Gabramedin. Eleni played a catalytic role in the creation of the Ethiopia Commodities Exchange. ECX, as it's known, is a story of sacrifice and partnerships with many different actors, including not only the government of Ethiopia and international donors, but also a team of highly talented returned diasporans and other expatriates and newly trained Ethiopian local staff who were committed to a new way of working. While each one of these roles was essential to the success of ECX, it is commonly recognized by all of these actors that the ECX would not exist were it not for Eleni. Why? The ECX was her brainchild. It stemmed out of her dissertation research on agricultural markets in Ethiopia, and it reflected her continued research, learning, and experience as a senior researcher at the International Food Policy Research Institute. She designed the ECX, she successfully promoted a diaspora recruitment strategy to staff it, and she became its first CEO. By the time she and the diaspora team stepped down, just in July 2012, ECX had traded 608,000 tons of commodities valued at over $1.5 billion, and the trading system linked 2.4 million farmers. So now let me tell you about the next story. This is Jammeh Adoum. He has worked both from the outside and the inside for change, for sustainable peace and good governance in Chad. He first advocated for an inclusive process in the peace process, including effective engagement of rebel groups. That was not very popular. But he thought it was important in order to have a sustainable peace agreement to involve all stakeholders. But when the rebellion was weakened in 2010, Idriss Déby, the president of Chad, asked him to join the government as a technical expert, applying his PhD in agricultural economics. First as technical advisor on rural development, and later as Minister of Agriculture and Irrigation. He served 1.5 years of a 3-year term when Déby announced a new cabinet. But by then, Jammeh had already completed, through a participatory process, a strategic development plan for the agricultural sector with political commitments and donor funding. He had introduced technical innovations to modernize the ag sector, giving stakeholders a flavor of what's possible. And he secured new and renewed donor programming that's responsive and targeted to small farmers and will extend beyond his tenure as minister. And finally, he empowered stakeholders who can potentially hold the government to account. He's currently the Secretary General of the Permanent Interstate Committee for Drought Control in the Sahel. So he's working at an intergovernmental regional level at this point. So now I'll explain the components of the in-between advantage, and I'll illustrate them through these examples. So, the back with the future effect. This refers to diasporans knowing what the future can be because they've already lived it in diaspora. The in-between advantage links problem understanding with potential solutions. Moreover, it encompasses an ability to envision greater institutional opportunities and thus perceive a much larger arena wherein change might take place. Gabra Medine, through her education and exposure to markets living in Europe and in the United States, she learned how to examine market operations, identify constraints, and rectify them by addressing information asymmetries. As a diasporan, she could perceive and systematically study a broad range of institutional alternatives to the status quo of commodity exchange in Ethiopia. And despite the many infrastructural challenges, she had confidence that the Ethiopia Commodities Exchange could be established with the help of international and primarily diasporan expertise and Western management styles. On his part, Adoum believed that good governance reform was possible in Chad, which is no small thing, and that food insecurities could be redressed. Beyond his technical expertise as an agronomist, Adoum introduced standard good management practices such as performance budgeting, as well as transparency and performance accountability. Basic public administration stuff. He understood from his experience living in diaspora that he could organize a constituency of citizen beneficiaries, farmers in this case, who might continue to pressure the government for responsiveness beyond his tenure as minister. The fulcrum effect refers to the ability of diasporans to have an impact potentially exponentially greater than their ideational, material, or operational effort. In many cases, the reform that they introduce is not an innovation per se. It's not something that they created. It's just bringing an innovation that exists somewhere else into a new context, the country of origin. Gabra Medine, for example, given the previous absence of real-time information, and particularly in areas far removed from Addis Ababa, ECX's impact was direct and immediate, with ripple effects in every single stage of trade, from the producer to the aggregator and small trader to the exporter. Countries such as Chad, in the case of Adoum, suggest that there may be some contexts that are just so problematic that maybe a diasporan institutional entrepreneur is the only or among the very few who could even spark an idea for change. Adoum did not enter the government of Chad with a billowing banner labeled "Good Governance Reformer." If he had, one of the donor interviews that I had suggested he might have been killed. Instead, he focused on technical interventions and the introduction of benign managerial practices that he knew could be leveraged for broader governance responsiveness and effectiveness. There are also some operational advantages that I want to talk about. These include connecting various sources of resources, both material and non-material. Eleni Gabramedin was a powerful connector and interlocutor between the Ethiopian government and international donors. She had the confidence of both sets of actors, and she was able to convince each to buy into a joint process. In the planning stages of ECX, she leveraged international expertise beyond her own through the International Food Policy Research Institute. And for its execution, she was able successfully to recruit top international experts, in part due to her diaspora identity, which exuded deep commitment to Ethiopia, enthusiasm for the enterprise, and confidence that she could make it happen. Adum also was an effective interlocutor between the government of Chad and the international community, securing significant resources and convening meetings for establishing mutual learnings and understandings. He spoke the language of both stakeholder groups, and he could explain and introduce donor requirements and managerial expectations to his staff. Well, the in-between advantage also affords significant benefits to diaspora institutional entrepreneurs themselves, which enable their effectiveness, motivation, and perseverance. Among these is the opportunity to operate by exception that I spoke of earlier, and to hedge identities and risks. I want to say a couple things about motivation here. Diaspora institutional entrepreneurs may share several motivations associated with entrepreneurs. The motivation model that I develop in the book suggests that innovative diasporans may hold particular motivational tendencies that can be leveraged to great impact, specifically in the country of origin. These motivational advantages include the solidarity and justice passions, which is from Albert Hirschman's work, if you follow him, which sway them to direct contributions to the country of origin. It also includes status passions and achievement needs, which may be more readily achieved in the country of origin, especially given the fulcrum effect. Gabramedin's and Adum's stated motives suggest a passion for justice in terms of redressing extreme deprivation. Gabramedin hedged her identification with various groups and associated social supports and sanctions. She relied on her professional socialization and identification with an international technical community, both for credibility and confidence, giving her a degree of independence and trustworthiness in terms of perceived objectivity. Her outsider status enabled her to communicate directly and openly in ways and in contexts that would have been unacceptable for other Ethiopians. Gabramedin strategically used her Ethiopian identity to convince a variety of stakeholders of her good intentions. And in fact, government officials seemed to expect and explicitly sought and to capitalize on the diaspora team's deep, deep commitment to Ethiopia. In terms of Adum, he describes himself as a teller who does not engage in any dirty games. He may have lasted longer than most Chadian ministers under any circumstances, but given this orientation, the only explanation is that he was operating somewhat by exception and was not judged in the same way as a local person would have been. Hedging his identities, Adum is able to connect to the small farmer by reference to his childhood and family history, which is quite moving, to the international community through his expertise and professional experience in the US and with international donors, and by some accounts to all the stakeholders in between. Lest you think I'm a Pollyanna. Of course, there are also in between disadvantages. And time doesn't permit me to go into a lot of detail here, though I do in the book. I just want to point out that some resistance to change is universal. And it's not necessarily in response to diaspora participation in an institutional reform process. Anytime you introduce change, there are winners and losers, and you will have resistance. But I find that potential diaspora institutional entrepreneur disadvantages are not universal, and they may be mitigated. So before I share more with you, this says, who are the French speakers? He's un torchon de la République, so he's supposedly supporting the current regime. And here she's also supporting the political party in power. Now this one requires a little bit of explaining. Le roi des fourmis, he's the king of the ants. Why? Well, during his tenure as minister, there was drought and famine in one part of Chad. And so as the minister, he was responsible for coordinating the food aid. Some people felt that he did not make enough food available to the local population. As much as I could do research on it, I didn't find any evidence to corroborate that. He had followed all of the international protocols. But the whole idea of the ant is because when people don't have access to food, their only source of any kind of nutrition is to dig into the anthills. Okay? So here are my two findings about the potential disadvantages that I'm arguing are not as largely represented as we might think. The first one concerns non-acceptance. I did find that in all of the cases that I looked at, the individuals did experience some otherness, that they didn't quite fit in or they weren't looked at entirely as locals. But criticism along those lines was not universal. Direct beneficiaries of their efforts valued their difference and didn't seem to view it as being a negative thing at all. In fact, it was the opposite. They appreciated that given the opportunities that they had and what they were doing abroad, that they were willing to come home and help. Such sentiments were expressed, for example, by farmers in Chad and government officials in Ethiopia. Another criticism, though, that's often heard is how can these diasporans be relevant? They've been out of the country for so long. And in fact, I being hopeful, I anticipated that diaspora institutional entrepreneurs might have particular advantages as announcers of institutional reforms because they could reference previous institutions and build bridges to a new way of thinking. But I found several instances where the diaspora institutional entrepreneur was unaware of past institutions that might have been helpful to their reform efforts. But instead of utilizing specific institutional references, all of the diaspora institutional entrepreneurs that I studied framed their effort around shared identity, invoking emotions of pride as they promoted the glory of the homeland writ large. So they could kind of get around not knowing the specifics to appeal to this broader sense of shared identity and greatness. So, what are the lessons for development management? Well, one of the things that bothers me so much is that in international development, despite our lip service, we tend to want to blueprint everything. We tend to want to plan everything out and have a set structure for the way things are supposed to happen. And in the institutional reform literature, agency is literally referred to as a black box. Well, we know that individual efforts are necessary, but we're not going to study that. Or we don't study that. We're going to look at these broader macro level changes that may occur, right? Crazy. So, implications for development management, first and foremost, is that agency matters. What drives individuals, their motivation, who they are, what they specifically bring matters. So you can have the best blueprint in the world. It's not going to work if you don't find the right people to staff and promote it, okay? Secondly, diaspora institutional entrepreneurs can be valuable partners in institutional reform processes, especially as intermediaries, as we see in these examples. The Ethiopia Commodities Exchange is the culmination of a diaspora institutional entrepreneur catalyst, Gabra Medin, in partnership, and I can't stress that enough, in partnership with the government of Ethiopia and in partnership with international donors. ADUM similarly effectively partnered with international donors to promote good governance and improve technical outcomes in the ag sector in Chad. Another implication, and this goes with the first point, individuals matter. Diaspora institutional entrepreneurs may in fact possess particular comparative advantages in particular institutional reform processes, and sometimes these characteristics yield an ability to perform roles and provide specific inputs that no other actor can provide in that particular context. So individuals matter. Also, government and donor programs can lay the groundwork for potential institutional reform efforts in the future. For example, Eleni Gabramedine is the product of a Rockefeller Foundation African Dissertation Internship Award. I bet you never heard of that. Unfortunately, they don't exist anymore. But this was a program that incentivized country of origin related research and required local partnership and capacity building. So she went back to Ethiopia to do her dissertation research that was really the seeds of the concept of ECX, and then she got to operationalize that. How cool is that? If there are any doctoral students in the room, take note. You can make a difference, man. Okay, other lessons. Well, as I also already inferred, institutional reform is not a unilinear path. It's not entirely predictable. In each one of these cases, we move forward, we move backwards. We move forward, we move backwards, you know? But in the process, relationships are built, trust is established, and we begin to understand what might be possible, okay? Adum offers helpful tips to policymakers. He argues that the best way to determine if a diaspora institutional entrepreneur will be an effective partner in institutional reform efforts is to walk with them. This requires, okay, so in other words, you have to take a chance, right? This requires being willing to tolerate the ambiguity of not knowing in advance where the process will lead and what the diaspora institutional entrepreneur's true intentions and capacities are. Tolerance for ambiguity is a characteristic of entrepreneurs, suggesting that any actor intent on promoting institutional change should consider their own potential to meet the needs of the process. Given that all actors are embedded in organizational systems, each with their own constraints to accountability and also in terms of responsiveness, it's likely that most potential participants in reform efforts, and notably donors, would fail this sniff test. While it's somewhat hackneyed, it remains true that institutional reform requires individual champions who are willing to test the boundaries of these constraints in the interest of effecting meaningful change. And those reformers need to come from multiple sources. Thank you very much.
So we have around 20 minutes for questions and answers.
Could you talk a little bit about the method you use to address the impact that the diasporans have on the country? Like, did you interview how many people, some of that stuff?
Absolutely. So first of all, I did not set out to measure impact. I did so explicitly. And most especially because if you know anything about institutional reform, you know that true impacts of institutional reform do not manifest until over a long period of time. And actually, reform and innovation in the industrial sector, there's been some really interesting research on that, that has found again and again that when you try to go back and trace where major reform in a sector occurred, that it's really, really difficult to figure out who sparked it. So it's, you know, so if you wait too long, you miss who were the protagonists. And if you don't do, you know, if you're not looking now, you can't, if you're looking only now, you can't measure impact. So I'm stuck in this dilemma. I don't know ultimately what the impact of these efforts will be. You know, the government of Ethiopia is a quasi, you know, the ECX is a quasi-public institution. It's supposed to be fully private, but it isn't. Now that the diaspora team is gone, is it just going to become an arm of the government? Maybe, I don't know. But at least we know that in this window, some change occurred, expectations were changed, the way people thought were changed. And even if the impact is not what we would have hoped or intended, there will be an impact, and I believe on the whole it will be positive. So that's just, you know. In other cases, it's a little bit easier to actually quantify things. But even there, you know, so my case study in Egypt concerns how a diasporan and her nonprofit organization is trying to reform the way the Coptic Orthodox Church provides social services to its flock. okay? Because they've had traditionally, historically, like a lot of religious institutions, a welfare approach. And she wants them to really do more than lip service to development, but actually do development work in providing services. So she's actually, her organization is having a tremendous impact on the way the church thinks about empowering people and working with education and treating people with respect. And there, I can actually count a little bit of impact because the volunteers that they work with, the church volunteers that they work with, a whole range of them have, after working with this organization, they've been tapped by the Coptic Orthodox Church to become priests, because the Coptic Orthodox Church recognizes that this is important. They also work with a lot of volunteers who are teachers, so it's impacting the way the teachers operate in the classroom with more of an empowerment orientation to teaching. So anyway, I hope that kind of answers the impact question. In terms of how I did it, yes, it was through interviews. And those of you who are taking your research methods, you know, this is all qualitative research. I'm not doing any kind of quantitative analysis here. You can't answer these kinds of questions through quantitative research alone. You might be able to gather some information on impact, but to get into people's psychology, no, you got to interview, right? But I took special care to try to triangulate, and so even though in each country I kind of had a person that was helping me facilitate interviews, I always moved beyond that one person, and I always tried to interview other people. Through internet research and through word of mouth, I was able to identify critics and follow up and try to interview them. So I hope that answers your question. Yeah.
So, I mean, one way to help qualitative study, like in any qualitative study, is do a comparative analysis. So did you, in your book or anything, have an effort to compare diaspora, and especially Ethiopia has such a large diaspora, of a failed attempt at doing something on the same level of the ECX, and then comparing what was different in those two cases of a strong diaspora that came to Ethiopia, tried to start something or influence something, but it was a different direction or a different level of engagement, and then seeing what was different. Because I'm guessing in something like Ethiopia, like you said, opening up of the government will be a big causal indicator, just allowing them to allow someone at the ECX so they can attain middle income, upper middle income status in the country to look good in the world, not just because they really like their diaspora.
Right.
And so, did you talk about like a comparative analysis at all when you do Ethiopia?
Yeah. Well, I didn't look at failure cases. I wanted to. This is a theory building study, so I wanted to establish the potential and identify what criteria we would look for and what criteria we would test for, right? So as I mentioned, one of my important findings, and that gets reinforced by the cases, is that you can't really promote effective change unless you are embedded in local networks as well as international networks. And I think you find a lot of failure cases of returned diasporans, and I think oftentimes the cause of the failure is that they don't have the local networks. So none of these changes, even though I talk about the ECX being Eleni Gabramedine's brainchild, it was not a one-woman show, not by any stretch of the imagination. So I didn't look at failures, okay? But the other thing is, if you were to look at failures, you'd also have to ask the question of from what perspective. So in the Chadian case, originally I was going to include an historical comparison study that was a failure, but not for the reasons you might think. And then the chapters, these are such great stories, and the chapters got so long I decided it wasn't necessary to include the historical case. But the historical case was actually about Anacosa, which was an association of academics from the former Zaire, now the Democratic Republic of Congo. And long story short, they were trying to mobilize to envision a better future for Zaire. They end up connecting with Kabila in the bush, ended up supporting him a little bit. Kabila says, I need more than your money. I need you to come back and rebuild the country once Mobutu is gone. They agree, and the ones who go back, despite all of their lofty ambitions, you're nodding as if you know this case, despite all their great intentions as stated previously, the ones who went back were later indicted on corruption. So it was a failure case because they got absorbed into the system rather than changing the system, so that's a possibility. I want to address one more thing though that was in your comment about the size of diaspora. I was very much influenced in this study by a friend and colleague who's at the World Bank, who for years has been arguing with those of us who study diasporas that it isn't the size of diasporas that matter. It isn't remittances that matter. It isn't any of these things. What matters most is finding that one individual who can catalyze major change. He's been saying that for years, and I decided I wanted to take that on with this study. So really, I mean, Ethiopia has a huge diaspora, but one of the things that's also really interesting about Ethiopia is that it has one of the most problematic diasporas in terms of the current regime. They are incredibly vocal and abusive. You know, when the Ethiopian government has sent representatives, including the prime minister, to tour around the US to try to build support, he literally got tomatoes thrown at him, okay? So they yell, they scream, they all have these angry blogs, and yet the Ethiopian government was still so open to this idea. But to their credit, they recognize that the most vocal are not necessarily representative of the whole. And so you got to always look beyond the superficial to find those individuals who really do have potential to catalyze great things.
You had mentioned that diasporas, one of the disadvantages is non-acceptance or otherness, but you had also mentioned that beneficiaries of services or others are not perpetuating this non-acceptance. So what actors in the environment are the diasporas receiving non-acceptance from?
Well, you know, first, there are different layers of that. I think the most obvious question would be where you're going to find that first and foremost, and where that criticism is going to be the loudest is going to be in those stakeholder groups who will lose because of the proposed change. Okay, because I'm talking specifically about institutional reform. Okay, so the losers are really going to, and this is what happened actually. The ECX ends up taking on the coffee cartel in Ethiopia. And this is a really interesting story, but it's way too long to get into here. But they end up taking on the coffee cartel, and it gets so bad that the prime minister convenes a meeting of all of the stakeholders of the coffee industry, including the ECX. And these guys stand up before the prime minister and say, she's not Ethiopian, look at her. You know, you can't put a new suit on an old body and say that it's changed. You know, so they kept trying to accuse it because they were the losers. They were the losers, okay? But I also don't want to be that simplistic. I think there's a broader phenomenon that also goes on. And particularly when you're talking about countries that have suffered from conflict. And this is also true in Ethiopia. It's certainly true in Chad, certainly true in the DRC. And where we find it, if you were to do an internet search, where you would mostly find it right now is in Liberia. Okay, that when returned diasporans come back to a country that has suffered from conflict, they are deeply resented because you weren't here, you didn't suffer with us. And now you want to come back and get goodies. Now you want to come back and have power. So I don't want to be naive about this. I say that these are, you know, potential disadvantages that can be mitigated, but they're there. They're definitely there. And so what that means is that the returned diasporan has that additional hurdle of trust building. That they have to show that they're not there for their own well-being, just to gain goodies for themselves, but that they really want to make a difference and work with local people and have an impact. Now, I have 2 chapters on Ethiopia. The other chapter is about returned business entrepreneurs. And one of these guys, he is the entrepreneurial personality. He's like the prototype. But along with that sometimes comes some hubris, right? So he was very, very vocal about all of his great achievements, including founding the bank that was in one of the photos at the beginning of the presentation. Well, you know, people didn't like that, and he ended up getting harassed by several different sources within government, both at the federal level and in the city of Addis Ababa, and in the banking industry. He founded this bank, and then he was barred from serving on any bank boards. And eventually, you know, actually right as I was finalizing this chapter, I say, hey, what's new with Amelga? And I get online, I start doing a search, where is he now? He fled the country because he's going to be arrested. So yeah, this kind of, you know, you got to work with local people. You got to establish your good intentions.
Any other questions? So I have one for you. You talked about here and there, right?
Yeah.
And there means in the home
Country of
countries.
origin, yeah.
And you talked about the acceptance or the non-acceptance as well as the irrelevance and the home countries.
Yes.
There.
Yes.
So what about here?
What about here in terms of?
In terms of, well, these diasporas are, for example, in the US, so what kind of challenges they might be facing here?
Yeah.
And probably this is not in the book, but
Yeah.
based on your
Well, you know, my argument about how entrepreneurial characteristics may be overrepresented in these communities actually comes out of a long history of research on immigrant communities. But the findings from that literature are all about immigrant communities and establishing entrepreneurial ventures in the US. So a lot of the arguments do apply in both places. Also operating by exception, all of those things happen, okay? But if you want to put it in the context of international development in particular, this is why Jemay Adum came up with this idea of walk with them. You know, walk with me. They had organized when he was still working for an inclusive peace process before he joined the government, when the rebellion was still in full force in Chad. They had organized a multi-stakeholder meeting in New York with the UN, and he was there to represent the diaspora along with a couple of other folks, and they were really trying to make their argument to the international policy community. We got to get away from only thinking about Darfur and Sudan and Chad. There are spillover effects on both sides of the borders. We're fueling each other's wars, and you got to work with us, and it's got to be inclusive, right? And he got so frustrated because they weren't listening to him. They weren't giving him credibility because they just thought, oh, who are you? You're from there, but what do you know? And so he finally literally stood up and he said to them, you guys do what you want, but this has been going on for decades and nothing has changed. So we're going to do what we're going to do. And if you want to do it with us, we welcome you. And if you don't, see ya. And then he's got this great sense of humor, and then he goes, okay. I'm not trying to be that mean. And he comes back and he says, but what I'm trying to say is walk with me. You know, you don't trust me. You don't believe that I have capacity. You don't believe in my good intentions. But why are you making that assumption? Let's walk together. I don't know what your intentions are either. Let's figure it out through experience. Right? So that kind of non-acceptance happens on both sides.
Yeah. One question for you. Did you find that when you were doing these interviews that people were more connected to maybe their region or where they're from or their community, or were they more connected to their country as a whole? I'm sure that some folks might just be like, I want to take care of my family and them, compared to taking care of these folks that I might have.
Right. Well, in my broader research, I find all of the above. But in this particular research, I have a biased sample because I'm looking at national level institutional reform. So none of them came back saying I only want to give here, because by definition I selected them because they wanted a larger focus. Yeah.
What influence do you think culture has on how the dynamics of diasporas work? For example, African nations versus Latin America versus Asia diaspora.
Mm-hmm. You know, I'm sure there is some interesting stuff to look at there, but I have to tell you, this is one of the things that makes me so excited about this research that I've been doing and why I've stayed with it so long. I had the privilege of participating in the global forums for migration and development for like the first 4 or 5 years of these forums, and they would bring together, among other folks, representatives of diaspora organizations from all over the world who were living in countries from all over the world. And through that experience, what I learned is that this whole concept of diaspora identity is really universal. And there is a wonderful, wonderful woman who is working at Oxfam Novib, which is the Dutch branch of Oxfam. And she actually was organizing the diaspora sector in the Netherlands. So she was helping them to create organizations and networks of organizations so that they could be more effective as development partners. And so it was like walking into a laboratory of people from all over the world, and then watching their progress as they began to form organizations of their own and then network with organizations that were from different countries of origin. And again, that was my finding, was just how universal this, it's a visceral thing for these people, you know? I have to give back because it's who I am. I have to stay connected because it's almost like a matter of psychological survival. And what's wonderful with the groups who are so motivated to create organizations is that they want to do it for the purpose of philanthropy, not just to make money or seize power. And again, I don't want to be Pollyanna about this. You know, one of my early articles about Jemaah Adum and the efforts that they had in trying to promote political reform started out with a comparison to Chalabi in Iraq, okay? Where we can exaggerate this potential and we have to be careful not to make assumptions. But anyway, it's a nice thing to see the commonalities. Yeah.
You mentioned the desire to be philanthropic with a lot of these institutional reforms, but what does the funding kind of look like for the longevity of these projects? I know you mentioned a couple times donors or things like that, but how can these sustain?
Well, in the case, interestingly, in Ethiopia, so donors had already committed a certain amount of resources for the agricultural sector in Ethiopia. And these were not, you know, negligible, the amounts, because food security is a big issue in Ethiopia. When the government became convinced that the ECX was the way to go, they actually renegotiated with the donors, not for extra money, but to redirect the money that they had already targeted to other kinds of ag projects to support this diaspora recruitment strategy to kickstart the ECX. So the money came from donors, but because it came with the commitment of the government, the potential for sustainability is longer, I think, okay? The interesting case is actually with Egypt, this NGO. It's an international NGO called Coptic Orphans, but they don't just work with orphans. And what's so interesting is I've had the privilege, both in the case of Coptic Orphans and in the case of Jemaah, I have known these individuals for at least 12, 13 years. So I've been able to follow the evolution of their work. And Nermeen Riyad, the founder of Coptic Orphans, told me early on, she said, Jennifer, money is not the problem. I have all the money I need. Capacity is my problem. Strategy is my problem. Can you imagine? How great to be a philanthropic organization and say money is not your problem. But it's true. And why? Because of the donations from the diaspora. You know, what's known as, you know, the social remittances, you know, giving money for philanthropic purposes. And they have fundraisers all over the world. They have offices in Australia and the UK as well as Canada and the US. And they do some fundraising through the church. So they have a lot of money, but with the kinds of impacts that she wants to have, she doesn't want to throw money at the problem because she thinks that's going to make it worse. She wants to make sure that her local staff is up to speed and really being able to implement the thinking and the new strategies. So in her case, totally sustainable. Totally sustainable. So sustainability of financial resources to keep things going can come from a variety of sources. But real sustainability, and I hope that Professor Abu Asi is teaching all of you this. Real sustainability in development management is about generating enough value that people will want to continue to make the investments necessary to produce the outcome. Okay?